These crimes were so horrific that the courts decided those responsible should never be released. One of these inmates was arrested for murder, but when interviewed, he confessed to 4 murders, leaving police searching for victims they didn't even know existed. Another had already murdered 2 elderly women and spent decades behind bars, only to kill again just 18 months after being released. And another made a fake 999 call to lure 2 unarmed police officers into a deadly trap. The offenders mentioned in this video have all received the same sentence, a whole life order. It is the most severe punishment available under UK law, meaning unless their sentence is overturned on appeal, they will never be eligible for release. At the latest official count, 74 prisoners in England and Wales were serving a whole life order in 2025. But that number continues to change as new whole life orders are imposed, including another being handed down just days before this video was uploaded. In the first video, we covered just 10 of the prisoners to receive this sentence. These are 10 more. We'll start with David Fuller, a man who managed to hide the true extent of his crimes for more than 3 decades. But once he was finally arrested, police uncovered something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. On the 23rd of June 1987, 25-year-old Wendy Nell was murdered at her home on Guildford Road in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. Wendy had been beaten and strangled before being sexually assaulted. She was found in her bed the following day by her boyfriend after she failed to turn up for work. Just 5 months later, on the 24th of November, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce disappeared from her home in Grosvenor Park. A neighbour reported hearing screams, but Caroline wouldn't be found for another 3 weeks, when a farmer discovered her body in a field more than 40 miles away. The similarities between the 2 murders led police to believe they were connected, and the cases became known as the Bedsit murders. The judge would later describe both of the killings as sexually motivated. But despite an extensive and highly publicised investigation, the man responsible remained unidentified for more than 30 years. But that finally changed when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence recovered from the crime scene. Police approached almost 100 people for DNA samples, eventually discovering a close familial match to David. Investigators began studying the family tree, and when David's own DNA was obtained, it matched the crime scene samples. Even the tread of bloody footprints recovered from one of the scenes corresponded with the footwear David could be seen wearing in an old photograph. On the 3rd of December 2020, 68-year-old David Fuller was arrested. He had been just 32 when he committed the murders. But when police searched his home, they discovered that the killings were only part of the story. Hidden behind a chest of drawers inside a wardrobe were 4 portable hard drives. In the decades following the murders, David had worked in maintenance at hospitals, giving him access to areas normally closed to the public, including the mortuaries. After mortuary staff had gone home, he would use his swipe card to enter, and once away from CCTV, he would sexually abuse the bodies of women and girls. Investigators discovered that he had abused at least 101 deceased victims. The youngest was just 9 years old, and the oldest was 100. David had even recorded everything. He photographed and filmed the abuse before transferring the files onto hard drives and other storage devices. Some victims were even abused on multiple occasions. These recordings stretched back to 2005, with some made as recently as around a week before his arrest. Police recovered around 14 million files across hard drives, CDs, floppy disks, and other material. More than 10 officers would spend around a year examining what had been found. The recordings showed that David had even positioned his victims, but any further details of what they contained are far too graphic for me to go into here. Investigators also discovered printed images hidden in his office and in the wardrobe. evidence that he'd researched some of the victims online, and an internet history showing an obsession with rape and murder. And even before the bedsit murders, David had reportedly committed at least 30 offences that police described as creeper burglaries, entering people's homes without ever receiving a prison sentence. Sentencing him, the judge told David, "You committed revolting and outrageous acts of the deepest darkness." For the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, David Fuller was given a whole life order. He also received additional concurrent sentences for the offences committed against the deceased victims, with further victims identified as the investigation continued. 10, however, have never been identified. This next prisoner murdered 4 people in the space of just a week, including twin sisters, whose bodies were found wrapped in plastic bags inside the same flat. In 2004, Mark Hobson was 35 years old and living in Selby with his girlfriend, 27-year-old Claire Sanderson. Claire was beaten to death with a hammer inside the flat that they shared before Mark wrapped her body in bin bags and left her inside the property. A week later, he contacted Claire's twin sister, Diane, and lured her to the same flat. When Diane arrived, prosecutors said that Mark raped her before strangling her to death. Diane's body was also wrapped in plastic bags and left inside the flat. On the 18th of July 2004, Diane's boyfriend and the twins' dad entered the flat after becoming concerned. Inside, they discovered both the sisters dead. But just hours later, and around 25 miles away, police were confronted with another double murder. 80-year-old James Bierton and his 82-year-old wife Joan had been murdered inside their home in Strensall. Both had been beaten with James's walking stick before being stabbed to death. Initially, detectives treated the 2 crimes separately, but forensic evidence soon connected Mark Hobson to all 4 murders, triggering a huge manhunt. For 8 days, Mark remained on the run, sleeping rough and moving through the countryside before members of the public spotted him in a field near the A19, around 6 miles from York. And as police investigated further, they discovered evidence suggesting his killing spree may not have been finished. Handwritten notes found by officers contained other names they believed could have been future intended victims, including the parents of Claire and Diane. In 2005, Mark Hobson pleaded guilty to all 4 murders and was given a whole life order. He became the first person in Britain to receive a whole life order after pleading guilty to murder, meaning despite admitting to his crimes, Mark Hobson will never be eligible for release. This next prisoner was arrested after his neighbour was found brutally murdered inside his own home. But when police questioned him, he didn't confess to just 1 murder. He confessed to 4. The problem was, police had no idea who the other 3 victims were. In August 1988, 21-year-old Anthony Arkwright was living in Wath-upon-Dearne in South Yorkshire. On the 29th of August, the mum of 25-year-old Marcus Law arrived at her son's specially adapted bungalow. Marcus used a wheelchair following a motorcycle accident and lived just a short distance from Anthony. Inside, his mum discovered a horrific scene. Marcus had been stabbed at least 70 times before his eyes were gouged out, and cigarettes were placed in his eye sockets, nostrils, ears, and mouth. He was also found with one of his crutches protruding from a gaping wound in his stomach, and Anthony had said that it had been payback for all of the cigarettes that Marcus had allegedly scrounged from Anthony. Around an hour before this discovery, Anthony had reportedly approached a woman and made a disturbing comment. "Sorry about poor old Marcus. He's killed himself." This was enough to make him a prime suspect, so police arrested Anthony. But during questioning, he eventually confessed to killing 4 people. At that moment, officers only knew about Marcus, so now they had 3 more potential victims to find. It soon emerged that another of Anthony's neighbours was missing. 46-year-old former teacher Raymond Ford. Raymond had previously reported Anthony to police for stealing from his flat, and Anthony apparently wanted revenge. In the early hours of the previous day, Anthony had entered Raymond's home, removed his clothes, and put on a devil mask before launching an extraordinarily violent attack. Raymond was stabbed over 250 times before his organs were removed and hung around the flat. Anthony returned home, showered, and got changed. Shortly after this murder, police knocked on his door to question him about the theft that Raymond had reported. They interviewed Anthony for around 3.5 hours before releasing him on bail, completely unaware that Raymond was already dead next door. Following this, Anthony went drinking, and within hours, he killed Marcus. But police still had 2 more victims to find. 6 days after they'd been killed, officers discovered the bodies of Anthony's 68-year-old granddad, Stanislav Podorkas, and his 73-year-old partner, Elsa Konradite. Elsa was found with an axe embedded in her head in their home, and police suspected Anthony had killed her while stealing around £3,000 of his granddad's savings. Stanislav had been attacked at his allotment. Anthony stabbed his granddad with such force that his spinal cord was severed, paralysing him, before dragging him into a shed and killing him with a heavy hammer. He allegedly killed him because of rumours that he believed that his granddad was actually his dad. Afterwards, Anthony went on a pub crawl, reportedly hinting at the murder, telling people it's been murder on the allotment today. All 4 murders occurred within approximately 56 hours. But despite his confession to 4 killings, there wasn't enough evidence to prove that Anthony had murdered Elsa. The violence had begun on the 26th of August, the same day that Anthony was sacked from his job at a scrap merchant for poor attendance. While awaiting trial, Anthony attempted to convince doctors that he was mentally ill and was transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital. But doctors there concluded that he was fit to stand trial, with one reportedly describing him as the sanest person in the building. Anthony was convicted of just 3 of the murders. The judge described him as an evil fantasist with a desire to become as notorious as Jack the Ripper. He was given a whole life order, making him, at the time, the youngest person in Britain to receive one. He was just 21 years old at the time of the murders. This next prisoner murdered 3 members of the same family on the night of a wedding, before leaving their 18-year-old daughter alive as the only witness to what he had done. Late on the 23rd of October 1983, 43-year-old Arthur Hutchinson broke into the Leitner family home in Daw in Sheffield. Earlier that day, the family had just celebrated the wedding of their eldest daughter in a marquee in their garden. Arthur is believed to have been watching the celebrations and waiting for an opportunity to strike. After the celebrations, and once back inside their home, he stabbed 28-year-old Richard Leitner to death. When Richard's dad, Basil, a 59-year-old solicitor, had heard the commotion, he went to investigate and was stabbed 3 times on the stairs. Arthur then attacked Basil's wife, 58-year-old Dr. Avril, stabbing her 26 times. She fought back so desperately that her hands were cut to the bone. But there was another person still inside the house, 18-year-old Nicola Leitner. She was raped in her bedroom. Then Arthur led her down the stairs, past her dad's body, and through his blood, taking her to the wedding marquee, where he restrained and raped her again. He then even bragged that he had killed her family. Eventually, Arthur returned Nicola to her bedroom, restrained her arms and legs, pulled the bed covers over her, and told her not to suffocate herself before fleeing. The following morning, men arriving to dismantle the marquee discovered the bodies of Basil, Avril, and Richard, along with Nicola in a state of severe shock, and called the police. But at the scene, Arthur had left evidence behind. After the murders, he drank from a champagne bottle and bit into a block of cheese before putting it back in the fridge. Police managed to recover a palm print from the bottle and made a cast of the teeth marks. Arthur's blood was also discovered on Nicola's bed. Nicola described her attacker, allowing police to produce a drawing, and that's when another police force recognised him. Just weeks earlier, Arthur had been arrested on suspicion of rape, burglary and theft. While being held at Selby Police Station, he asked to use the toilet before escaping through a window, cutting himself on barbed wire below as he fled. 3 weeks later, he murdered the Leitner family. Now wanted for murder, Arthur nicknamed himself the Fox, writing to police denying the killings and even contacting a newspaper to boast about his ability to evade capture. But police knew that Arthur regularly contacted his mum, so they bugged her home telephone. When officers intercepted a call indicating he was returning home, hundreds of police officers descended on the area. On the 5th of November, Arthur was finally captured outside Hartlepool after stabbing himself in the stomach. He denied the murders, claiming he'd previously met Nicola and that somebody else had killed her family. But the court rejected his story. Arthur was convicted of the 3 murders, rape and aggravated burglary. Although the judge initially recommended that he serve a minimum of 18 years, the Home Secretary later determined that Arthur should never be released. He has since tried to challenge that decision 4 times, but every attempt has failed. This next inmate murdered 2 people in their homes just weeks apart, and after one of the killings, he calmly sat and watched a film while his victim lay dead nearby. In January 2012, 48-year-old Stephen Farrow targeted 77-year-old retired teacher Betty Yates at her home in Worcestershire. Betty had been beaten with her own walking stick until she was unconscious. Stephen then positioned her head on a pillow before stabbing her 4 times, leaving the knife embedded in her neck. Her body was discovered at the bottom of the stairs on the 4th of January, but initially, police had no major leads. Then just weeks later, Stephen killed again. On the 13th of February, he arrived at the vicarage of 59-year-old Reverend John Suddards in Thornbury in Gloucestershire. John allowed Stephen into his home, but as the two stood in the hallway, Stephen suddenly attacked him with a knife. When John attempted to get back to his feet, Stephen kicked him back down and watched as he died, even telling him to hurry up and die. Stephen then sat in John's living room, drank beer and watched an Indiana Jones DVD. He would later tell psychiatrists that he'd even considered crucifying John to the floor. Before leaving, Stephen arranged a number of degrading and deliberately provocative objects around John's body, including sexual material and religious imagery. But the murder of a vicar wasn't Stephen's first expression of hatred towards Christianity. Not long before the killings, he had burgled a cottage in the same area. When the owners returned, they discovered a threatening note pinned to their kitchen table with 2 knives. It read, "Be thankful you did not come back, or we would have killed you Christian scum. I hate God." 6 days after John's murder, Stephen was arrested in Folkestone in Kent following a nationwide manhunt. And investigators were able to connect him to Betty's still unsolved murder. His DNA was recovered from her left hand, while bloody footprints found at the scene were matched to his boots. Stephen denied murdering Betty and admitted only the manslaughter of John on the grounds of diminished responsibility. But the jury rejected his account and he was convicted of both murders. Psychiatrists diagnosed Stephen with a psychopathic personality disorder. He claimed his hatred of Christianity stemmed from abuse by a priest during his childhood, although he was also described as a pathological liar with a grandiose sense of self-worth. His violent fantasies had been documented years earlier. Following a burglary conviction in 1994, Stephen had reportedly spoken to psychiatrists about fantasies involving rape during home invasions and claimed he had wanted to kill since his teenage years. He even claimed to have already murdered a backpacker, although one doctor believed he was exaggerating his behaviour in an attempt to secure detention in a psychiatric hospital rather than in a prison. For the murders of Betty Yates and Reverend John Suddards, Stephen Farrow was handed a whole life order. 10 years later, Stephen died at HMP Frankland on the 21st of August 2023, aged 58. A cause of death has never been released. This next prisoner murdered 2 of his neighbours just weeks apart, and as police arrived at the building to investigate the first murder, he was in a neighbouring flat cleaning up after the second. In July 2010, 48-year-old Andrew Dawson had only recently moved into a block of flats on Waterford Drive in Chaddesden in Derby. On the 25th of July, 66-year-old John Matthews was found dead inside his flat. His badly decomposed body was found in the bathtub, which contained water and bleach. Initially, it was believed that John may have taken his own life, but a post-mortem examination revealed the truth. He had been stabbed 18 times. Just 5 days later, on the 30th of July, another resident in the same building was also discovered dead. 58-year-old Paul Hancock had also been placed in his bathtub. He had been stabbed 22 times. Andrew had reportedly gained access to the men's flats under the pretense of asking to use their washing machine. And remarkably, as police arrived at the building to investigate the murder of John Matthews, Andrew was apparently still inside Paul's flat, cleaning up the scene of the second murder. Panicked, he packed a bag and fled. But this wasn't the first time that Andrew Dawson had killed. At the time of these 2 murders, he was already a convicted killer who had been released from prison on licence. Back in 1981, when Andrew was just 18 years old, he entered a shop in Ormskirk. Inside was 91-year-old Henry Walsh. When Henry disturbed his intended burglary and told Andrew, "I know who you are," Andrew picked up a bread knife and stabbed him 11 times in the chest, leaving the knife embedded in his body. Henry's body was found hanging from a door hook. He had also suffered a fractured jaw and a ligature around his neck. Andrew then left with a small amount of change and Henry's pension book, which he later cashed for just £50. For that murder, Andrew received a life sentence, but decades later, he was released, and while on licence for killing Henry, he murdered John Matthews and Paul Hancock. Following these second murders, police eventually tracked Andrew more than 170 miles away in Whitehaven in Cumbria. He was found asleep on a bench, carrying 7 kitchen knives. When confronted, Andrew ran into the sea before eventually swimming back towards the officers, where he was tasered and arrested. He would later tell police that he had experienced an urge to kill, and inside his flat, investigators discovered a notebook containing what appeared to be a confession to just one of the murders, signed, "Yours, the Angel of Mercy." Andrew initially denied murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but later changed his pleas and admitted killing both men. The judge described them as cold, calculated, and savage attacks. This next prisoner murdered 4 people inside the same house overnight. 3 of them were children, one of which had simply gone there for a sleepover. In September 2021, police were called to a house in Killamarsh in Derbyshire, where 4 bodies were discovered inside. The victims were 35-year-old Terry Harris, her 13-year-old son John Paul Bennett, her 11-year-old daughter Lacey Bennett, and Lacey's 11-year-old friend Connie Gent, who had been staying at the house for a sleepover. Terry was also pregnant with Damien Bendall's child. Damien had met Terry online and at the time was living in the property with the family. On the night of the murders, he had taken drugs and attacked all 4 victims using a claw hammer. Terry was attacked first, before Damien moved through the house, killing the 3 children. The violence was sustained and extreme. But one of the most disturbing aspects of the case involved 11-year-old Lacey. After attacking her, Damien raped Lacey as she lay dying. After the murders, Damien contacted the police himself. When officers arrived, he was still at the property, but questions would soon be raised about why Damien had been there in the first place. At the time of the murders, he was already serving a suspended sentence and was being supervised by probation following an earlier conviction for arson. Despite a lengthy history of offending, he had been assessed as posing a low risk of serious harm to the public. A later review found serious failings in the way his case had been handled and concluded that he should have been assessed as high risk. Damien initially denied the murders, before later admitting all 4 killings, as well as the rape of Lacey. In 2022, he was handed a whole life order, and even after receiving that sentence, the violence continued. In May 2024, while inside prison, Damien attacked fellow inmate Michael Mullany with another claw hammer in a prison workshop, striking him in the back of the head without warning. The court heard that the 2 men had regularly played dominoes together, but Damien had apparently planned the attack because he wanted to be moved into segregation. When later asked why he did it, his response was simply, "I don't know." This next inmate planned to murder his former partner and their 2-year-old daughter because he couldn't accept that their relationship was over. Chillingly, another child was inside the house as it happened. In the early hours of the 6th of June 2011, 50-year-old David Oakes let himself into the home of his ex-partner, 38-year-old Christine Chambers, in Braintree in Essex. He used a key that he had never returned. Christine had ended the relationship and wanted to move on with her life. She had made it clear that David could continue seeing their 2-year-old daughter Shania for 3 weekends out of 4. But David couldn't accept that Christine no longer wanted to be with him. The murders took place the night before a potentially crucial court hearing, and David had planned what he was going to do in horrifying detail. He arrived carrying a 12-bore shotgun and ammunition, an axe, knives, heavy-duty pliers, a drill, and petrol. Inside the house was Christine's 10-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. She would later describe how David subjected her mum to hours of torture and degrading attacks. Christine was beaten with his fists, the shotgun, and an axe which cut through her skull. Her torso was disfigured with knives, and she was shot in the knee and abdomen and forced to cut her own hair. At one point, David made Christine beg and tell him that she loved him. Her daughter recalled him telling her mum, "I want you to suffer as much as I have." Eventually, David shot Christine in the head. But he wasn't finished. Neighbours who heard the gunshot later recalled hearing 2-year-old Shania crying for several minutes. David then shot his own daughter in the head. The judge would later say that Shania was likely to have witnessed at least some of the horrific violence inflicted upon her mum. But Christine's 10-year-old daughter managed to escape. She climbed out of an upstairs bedroom and ran to her dad's nearby home to get help. David then turned the shotgun on himself, shooting himself in the head. It was also reported that he attempted to drill holes into his own skull. When emergency services entered the property, he was still alive and semi-conscious. This hadn't been the first time that David had been violent towards Christine. Their relationship had lasted around 5 or 6 years, and he was described as controlling, bullying, and frequently violent. On one occasion, he reportedly attempted to run Christine over. On another, neighbours witnessed him dragging her from the house by her hair. Less than 2 months before the murders, Christine had obtained a non-molestation order, preventing David from coming within 100 metres of her street. At trial, David denied the murders. His defence even claimed that Christine had killed Shania, while David said he couldn't remember how either he or Christine had been shot. Because he refused to admit what he'd done, Christine's surviving 10-year-old daughter was forced to give evidence about what she had witnessed. Sentencing David, the judge said Christine carried not a shred of blame for what had happened that night, describing David's reaction to the end of their relationship as purely selfish, self-pitying, and grotesquely violent. David Oakes would spend less than a year serving his whole life order. He died in prison, reportedly from cancer. This next prisoner had already murdered 2 elderly women and spent decades behind bars. But just 18 months after being released on licence, he killed again. On the 9th of November 2021, 62-year-old Lawrence Bierton was living next door to 73-year-old Pauline Quinn in Nottinghamshire. That day, Lawrence climbed over the garden fence separating their properties and approached Pauline asking for money to buy alcohol. When she refused, he pushed her to the ground before following her into her bungalow. Pauline managed to activate an emergency alarm code inside her home, but tragically, it couldn't save her. Lawrence attacked Pauline using her own coffee table, striking her at least 14 times. 10 of these blows were to her head. She suffered a fractured skull and significant brain injuries, as well as defensive wounds to her arms. In total, Pauline had 29 separate injuries. Because Pauline had activated her alarm, part of the attack was actually recorded. The system automatically began making an audio recording, capturing a series of loud bangs, believed to have been Lawrence attacking her. Importantly, there were long pauses between some of the sounds. At trial, Lawrence claimed diminished responsibility, arguing that alcohol dependency disorder amounted to a mental abnormality. But the jury rejected his defense. The judge said that the pauses captured on the recording demonstrated that this wasn't simply a frenzied attack. Lawrence had remained in control and repeatedly chose to continue delivering further blows to make sure Pauline was dead. Afterwards, he fled in Pauline's car. But Pauline wasn't the first elderly woman that Lawrence had murdered inside their own home. She was the third. Back in June 1995, Lawrence and another man, Michael Pluck, murdered sisters Eileen Dudhill, who was 79, and 73-year-old Elsie Gregory at their home in Rotherham. The 2 men had previously carried out gardening work for the sisters. Eileen and Elsie were beaten to death before their killers set fire to their home. Lawrence was sentenced to life imprisonment for the double murder, but decades later he was released on licence. Just 18 months after that release, Pauline Quinn was murdered. The judge would later highlight how Pauline had been failed by the system, with a convicted double murderer having been housed alongside elderly and vulnerable residents. And there appeared to be no clear motive for any of the 3 killings. Describing Pauline's murder as senseless as it was brutal, the judge finally handed Lawrence Bierton a whole life order, ensuring he couldn't be released again. This next prisoner murdered 4 people during a violent feud, before making a fake 999 call and luring 2 unarmed police officers into a deadly trap. In 2012, Dale Cregan became involved in a violent feud between rival families in Greater Manchester. On the 25th of May, Dale arrived at the Cotton Tree pub in Droylsden. CCTV captured a car pulling up outside with 2 other men inside, while a masked gunman entered the pub and opened fire. 23-year-old Mark Short was killed and 3 other men were injured. Another intended target was also inside the pub, but survived simply because he'd gone to the toilet. Dale was questioned over Mark's murder and released on bail. But while on bail, he killed again. On the 10th of August, Dale waited outside the home of Mark's dad, 46-year-old David Short. When David emerged, reportedly on his way to visit his son's grave, Dale opened fire. David attempted to escape through his home, but Dale pursued him before shooting him repeatedly. As David laid on the ground, Dale threw a hand grenade close to his body. By this point, Dale had become one of the most wanted fugitives in Britain. For around a month, he remained on the run. Then, on the 18th of September 2012, at 10:14 in the morning, Dale made a call to emergency services reporting a burglary at a house in Mottram. But there was no burglary. It was a trap. 2 unarmed officers responded to the call, 23-year-old PC Nicola Hughes and 32-year-old PC Fiona Bourne. As they approached the house, Dale opened the door and began shooting. The officers tried to escape, but Nicola was shot in the back, immediately paralysing her. Dale then turned his attention to Fiona, firing repeatedly at her. He returned to Nicola, shot her in the head, and threw a grenade towards her body. Both officers were killed. And just minutes later, Dale calmly fled the scene. But unlike the previous murders, this time he didn't attempt to disappear. Later that same day, Dale walked into Hyde Police Station and handed himself in. He told the officers, "I've murdered 2 police officers." He would later claim he'd targeted the officers because police had been putting pressure on his family. And when discussing the earlier murder of David Short, Dale made another disturbing admission, saying, "The night I shot David, I had the best sleep of my life." At trial, the judge described Dale's crimes as premeditated savagery. He was convicted of the murders of Mark Short, David Short, PC Nicola Hughes, and PC Fiona Bourne, as well as a number of attempted murders. Of course, Dale Cregan also received a whole life order.